Bitcoin was built to help with humanitarian crises. So you definitely want to use that in this situation. And I wanted to ask about, a recent article. It was called "Bitcoin Won't Save the Afghan People," and yeah, you were quoted in there stating that likely, the Afghan crypto flows a likely capital flight for some wealthier Afghans to get money. So could you explain, is there a chance that the Afghan people could use Bitcoin for good, maybe in the near future or in the future at some point?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And again, that was looking at what had been happening historically over the past at least several months. And, in the previous instances, the Chainalysis report did really strong analytics as well. And so I want to commend Chainalysis on their work and, identifying Afghanistan actually as a jurisdiction that is using more crypto. And, I think, again, positive development, despite all the problems going on in the country. But, I think that there are use cases, and I think it is up to the crypto community. It is up to humanitarian assistance organizations to find the right use cases for it. It's not going to be a silver bullet. And then also recognizing, again, the huge problems of the normal, conventional, traditional financial system for affecting money laundering, terrorism financing, sanctions evasion, and all these other ills that have been happening through Afghanistan, despite the best efforts of a dedicated and committed Afghan government, the best efforts of the U.S. and international community to combat that. Again, Afghanistan still exports, I believe, 85% of the world's heroin, according to the United Nations last year. 37% increase in land used to cultivate heroin. And so there is an economic and financial dimension. And to date, I'm not seeing that being used, through crypto being a vehicle to facilitate that money laundering and that narcotics trafficking, because the formal financial system, the informal Hawala system, very elegant and simple vehicles to do that as is. But again, for the positive use cases, again, this is up to the community to really step up and to find ways to make it work. And I think there is so much about crypto that can be verifiable, that can be identifiable, and that can help monitor funds that do go into the country in a way that dollars can't, because they are so fungible, or Afghani, the local currencies, are too fungible. They can go to bad actors without there being that same level of oversight. But I think there really is power with crypto in potentially having absolutely having stronger controls and potentially being a use case in Afghanistan under the correct circumstances.
Absolutely. And those circumstances hopefully include having better infrastructure, more technology available for people, of course. And one thing you discussed earlier was women, the women in Afghanistan. Even if Bitcoin was introduced as legal tender, do you think women in Afghanistan could enjoy the use case of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency as the men in that country?
I think this is really terrible what the Taliban is doing for women. I mean, we're seeing reports that they're denying girls access to school. Women are not allowed to go to work. As I said before, and I can't say it more clearly, I mean, the Afghan economy cannot thrive without the full participation of women. And that is not happening right now. The Taliban is being incredibly regressive. They are returning to their very, very tyrannical and horrific behaviors of the 1990s. And again, I think crypto has a potential for everyone, and is egalitarian, and it is is gender neutral in that way. But the problem is the structural issues that the international community needs to make sure that the Taliban is adhering to basic human rights, to these equality gains that have been made over the past 20 years for the rights of women, for the rights of minorities, religious minorities in particular, the freedoms of the press, and also freedom of economic activity, that they are not going to shut down basic economic activity through the formal financial system as well. I mean, again, I think most of the economic activity that will help most Afghans right now is through the formal financial system. That's also where it's at highest risk for money laundering and terrorism financing.
Yep, absolutely. And that's one of the things I'm glad you hit on, was that Bitcoin is for everybody. So if it is introduced, women would have to be a part of that. And I did want to ask, is religious restrictions, is that any way tied to their use case for crypto in the future, or maybe blockchain technology in general?
That's a really good question. So we don't know right now. The Taliban kind of takes their radical interpretation of a religious doctrine and they use it for their political purposes. And they've done this throughout their rule. And so what we're seeing now is that they have, at least at local levels, and I'm not sure if it's at the national level yet, but they've restricted the provision of interest, or the allowing interest through formal banks and through the formal banking system. because they identify it as a religious prohibition. Again, that's their interpretation of it. There is Islamic banking in Afghanistan. There are laws and regulations that permit it and that regulate it effectively. And I had the opportunity to learn about that and to work on those issues. So I guess the questions are, do they have a really big concern about issuing interest, or allowing the provision of interest, or do they find other ways to garner fees? Would they interpret crypto or certain aspects of crypto that do generate interest as being prohibited? These are active questions, yes. But I honestly don't have much confidence in the sophistication, economic and financial sophistication of the Taliban leadership at present. The new acting head of the central bank has been identified as a Taliban hardliner and someone who is a Taliban loyalist, rather than someone who has any identified economic or financial training, education, skill set background. And so the signal to the Afghan economy, to the Afghan private sector, and also, of course, to the international community, is that the Taliban is promoting loyalty to the group and to the organization rather than technical competency to be able to answer those very questions about how to fairly and how to appropriately reconcile values, cultural norms, etc., with economic needs and economic requirements and necessities. And we've seen that also, and the leadership that the Taliban put in place for their interim government is really atrocious. It's all men. There are no women. It's mostly from Pashto ethnicity, and they include someone who is identified by the U.S. On U.S. FBI's most wanted list and has a multi-million-dollar bounty on his head as their interior minister, and has been responsible for the injury and death of a number of U.S. service personnel and a number of American citizens. So that's really reprehensible. And these are the types of people that the Taliban has put in charge. And so, as I've called for in the recent article, look, if they put in a technocratic, independent head of the central bank and leadership in the central bank, Ministry of Finance, Financial Intelligence Unit, I think that would send a strong signal to the international community, as well as to the crypto community, that they're taking these issues seriously. But they're not going to do that. I don't see them doing that. And, it's a real tragedy on that end because, again, the idea to promote economic development in Afghanistan is essential for a prosperous Afghanistan, for a more egalitarian Afghanistan. It needs to be driven by a growing economy that actually produces things for the world to buy and to appreciate instead of heroin.
Oh yeah,
so that's a huge problem.
So what it sounds like is we need to get the Taliban out of the way in order to implement any of these financial services. So hopefully, that can happen sometime soon. But one thing I did want to ask was the economic recovery of Afghanistan. What does that mean for the U.S.? Does that actually help us in the long term? Does their recovery, our sanctions that we have against them, does that hurt us in some way? What do you say about that?
Yeah, so the sanctions, I want to be very clear, against the Taliban, right? So they're not against the Afghan country, they're not against the Afghan people, they're against the Taliban as a terrorist organization. Under the sanctions, it's a specially designated global terrorist. And just, I say that just because it's an important distinction that I think gets lost in these conversations when you talk about very complex legal, technical issues like economic sanctions enforcement. But the sanctions are against the Taliban, and it really is up to the Taliban to change their behavior and to change their approach to governing. Again, I think they're the ones who got us into this mess, and they're the ones who are going to need to get us out of this mess really, really profoundly. And the livelihood and the well-being of tens of millions of Afghans really rest in the balance on how they choose to conduct themselves within the country and govern themselves, and also before the international community. So that's a big part of it. Economically, Afghanistan, again, it's a tiny economy that it doesn't really, again, produce much. I want to see it produce things and export things and, engage in, viable economic activity that supports the region. But there's not much trade between the United States. So economically, Afghanistan is not consequential to the United States. It is consequential in this counterterrorism financing problem. I identified at least 17 terrorist groups that are operating in Afghanistan right now. And now you have another terrorist group, the Taliban, who is in charge of policing those other terrorist groups. So, literally the fox is in the hen house, and it's a really bad situation with consequences for, again, the U.S. economy more generally, because, this is the exact problem we were in the 1990s when the Taliban took over, that they allowed Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and other groups to have a safe haven in Afghanistan, where they have the space to plot the 9/11 terror attacks, which caused horrific damage to the American people, loss of nearly 3,000 lives, as well as untold, billions, if not more, in economic damage to the United States. So it's more on the downside, unfortunately, is managing that downside risk than any positive upside. I think, at least in the short term, unfortunately. But that's what we have to manage, and those are the tough decisions that our government and others are making right now about how to manage this crisis.
Absolutely, and it's definitely a tough thing to deal with, I will say. And my last question for you today, you dropped a lot of gems about Afghanistan. The last question I would have is,
Thank you.
I love it. Let's just say Bitcoin goes to $1 million in the next 5 years per coin, and crypto has a lot of value. $10 trillion market. Do you think that there will be any country who won't use Bitcoin or buy Bitcoin for themselves, including Afghanistan?
That's another awesome question. I don't like getting into predictive games too much. I come from the world of countering illicit finance. Yeah, no. So it's a really fair question. I wish I had a crystal ball, and again, but don't want to be doing investment advice. The other side of it is more just to grow to get to $1 million for Bitcoin. We need to have the community engage and get very serious on anti-money laundering, counterterrorism financing, tax compliance, sanctions enforcement, and sanctions compliance. To really make the system stronger. And this is a collective responsibility that we in the community have to do. I'm with my friends right now at TRM Labs. I'm at a conference at the Anti-Financial Crimes Conference. And this is really a huge moment for the crypto community, but we have to step up and take it seriously. We have to engage with Washington. We have to engage with state capitals. We have to engage with international capitals. And that is really where the game is going to be played, to get the frameworks right, to get the legal, regulatory, technical, as well as other components correct, to be able to build these infrastructure, build this community, and to have more widespread adoption to promote financial inclusion in places like Afghanistan, but also in parts of financially excluded places in the country, both rural and urban. To really promote a better financial future that allows for cheaper, safer, more secure financial activity for hundreds of millions, if not billions of. That's what we need to be working towards. And so, that's a responsibility we can work on together. And I would love to circle back with you again, see where the progress is going. But again, this is the community's responsibility, and we have to work together to raise the bar and make sure that we seize this moment in a really, really positive way.